Hi, thank you for joining me. Mindy Mandell here. So today I'm going to go on with these talks about the laws, and we're up to Book 9. Book 9 is focusing on what Plato calls judicial proceedings. And here what he's talking about is that aspect of the wisdom-loving part of the soul that watches our state of mind to help us maintain our wisdom and also to maybe see where some maintenance is needed. Now, all of our translations, as I've been using throughout the laws, are from Robert Gregg Bury. So this section is broken into 3 parts, and Plato calls them crimes against the gods and crimes against the polity, and then the 3rd part I'm going to call manner of judgment. Now, sometimes when I'm seeing the big picture of something, it comes to me all as like what I call the thought blob, where it's just one big blob. And then if I want to explain it to someone, it can be difficult because I have to stop and think about how to put it in a sequential order so that I can explain it to someone else. And it's difficult because when you see it as a whole, all the parts are kind of interrelated with one another. I say this because as I'm reading through this part of Book 9, it really feels like for Plato this was a thought blob. And there's something a bit artificial in the way he's trying to unfold it and the way he's trying to separate some parts into crimes against the god and some parts as crimes against the polity. They really do interconnect. I think rather than seeing fault with the layout, that it doesn't perfectly fit or whatever, I think that a better way to read this is whether he actually thought in this way or I'm just maybe projecting my own thought blob problem onto him. Either way, it really helps to try to put it back together into a whole. Once you see all the pieces, to try to kind of step back and see the whole and how our mistakes about the nature of reality, which would be the crimes against the gods, also interplay with our with the problems within our soul, maybe the ordering, like what he calls justice, the 3 parts doing their own proper function and tearing away what is false and so on. Those are the crimes against the polity. The 2 obviously play off each other, and that's why it doesn't neatly break into 2 separate groups. And so we're going to see some overlap, but it really helps to try to put it all back together and try to see the whole, because that's where the real richness of what he's painting for us really comes through. With that in mind, let's go on to the crimes against the gods, our misunderstandings about the nature of reality and our relationship to the divine. And he's going to call this temple robbery. He says, as a precaution against the general infirmity of human nature, I will state the law about temple robbing and all other crimes of a like kind, which are hard, if not impossible, to cure. So it is hard to convince people to even think in this way. Very few people even want to get into this kind of philosophy, as I'm sure all of you probably know. Okay, he says, by way of argument and admonition, one might address in the following terms the person whom an evil desire urges by day and wakes up at night, driving him to rob some sacred object. My good man, the evil force that now moves you and prompts you to go temple robbing is neither of human origin nor of divine, but it is some impulse bred of old in people from ancient wrongs unexpiated, which courses round wreaking ruin, and it you must guard against with all your strength. Okay, so what does he mean by ancient wrongs? Well, this, I think, takes us back to Book 3, where we learned about those family beliefs that we already hold at the time that we come to philosophy. Now, it was in Book 3 that we first really pinned down a definition of laws, because early on we were just talking about any belief that the soul holds, whether it was a true belief or a false belief. And then we pinned down that what we really mean by laws are the divine laws. And the family laws that we held, the family beliefs we held, well, some of them may be in line with wisdom, but others we're going to have to question and maybe toss out. Now, the ancient wrongs refers to the fact that often the things that we learn that are false from our parents, they learned from their parents, and their parents learned from their parents, and so on for many generations. And so these are ancient wrongs passed down through the generations. So as an example, a very simple one that I think many of us have had to deal with is a focus on being practical, and that being like a value, which really conflicts with what we're doing in philosophy, obviously. But like if you were taught to be practical minded, then very likely your parents learned that from their parents, and your grandparents learned that from their parents, and back for many generations. And so this is something that we're going to be challenged by, and something that we're going to have to face. We're going to see more of this idea coming up in Book 9 here. So no penalty that is legally imposed aims at evil, but it effects as a rule one or other of two results. It makes the person who suffers it either better or less bad. So this is that idea. It's considered a paradox, a Socratic paradox, that if you do wrong, it's better to be punished than to get away with it. And obviously most people want to get away with their wrongdoing, and so that's why it's called a paradox. But if we understand that for Plato, what we are in essence is soul, and we are here to learn and to grow, then obviously that's why being caught and being penalized would be a good thing if it is a legal penalty, if it is fitting and it's done in a just way. Then we will learn something and we will be better. Or at the very least, maybe we'll start to adjust. Maybe we're not quite ready to completely drop that false belief, but maybe we'll be less bad, less unhealthy. So his children and family, if they shun their father's ways, shall be honored, and honorable mention shall be made of them, seeing that they have done well and bravely in leaving the ways of vice for those of virtue. Again, about that idea of those ancient wrongs. If you drop the family belief, then there's honor in that. And you've acted bravely. You've left that particular type of vice that your family had been suffering from, that false belief passed through generations. You're leaving the ways of vice for those of virtue. Okay, now we'll go on to crimes against the polity, which again does have some overlap with crimes against the God, because obviously if there's a false belief about the nature of reality that results from the unhealthy ordering, for example, within the soul, or the factions within the soul, then you're going to see this overlap. They're interrelated. But what he's talking about specifically here is what he's calling the dissolution of the polity, or bringing factions into the soul, losing that unity. So whosoever enslaves the laws by making them subject to men, not recognizing the gods, is where we get our wisdom from and what guides us. So there's that overlap, right? But making the laws subject to humans and making the state subject to a faction, and acts illegally in doing all this by violence and in stirring up civil strife, which is an image we've been seeing throughout. Well, such a person must be deemed the worst of all enemies to the whole state or soul. And the person who, though he takes part in none of these doings, yet fails to observe them, while he has a share in the chief offices of state, or else, though he observes them, fails to defend his country and punish them, owing to his cowardice, a citizen of such a kind must be counted second in order of badness. So the first wrong is allowing these factions into the soul, letting ignorance into the soul. And the second wrong, the second place wrong, is not watching the soul, and not watching your state of mind, and therefore allowing this ignorance to seep into the soul. As a summary rule, the disgrace or punishment inflicted on a father shall not descend upon his children, except in a case where not only the father, but his father and grandfather before him have all been condemned on a capital charge. So again, not every wrong, not every false belief we hold is going to pass to our children, but there are those family beliefs that have been passing from generation to generation, and those very likely will go to the kids. Sorry, kids. So we need to watch that, especially those of us who are parents. We want to end with our generation and those beliefs patterns. Okay, now this third section I'm calling manner of judgment. Now Plato is going to introduce a third kind of crime that he's calling treason. And it seems at first that maybe that's where it's going, that there are three kinds of crimes, but it becomes very clear that what he's really talking about in this section is the manner of judgment. He never actually defines what he means by treason, or he makes it clear that it is something different from crimes against polity, because he names all three. We're going to see in a quote in just a moment. But he never clarifies what he means by treason. So we can try to guess or fill in the blanks, but we really want to know what Plato thinks it means. And unfortunately, he doesn't tell us. And what his focus is on is not treason, but this manner of judgment. So here's where he introduces it. Moreover, a third general rule shall be laid down, dealing with the judges to be employed and the manner of the trials, in cases where one person prosecutes another on a charge of treason, and concerning the offspring likewise, whether they are to remain in the country or be expelled. This one law shall apply to the three cases of the traitor, the temple robber, and the person who wrecks the state laws by violence. So it's clear the temple robbers was our first category. The person who wrecks the state laws by violence was defined as the second. We're not really sure what he means by the traitor. He never quite tells us what he means by that. But what he's going to go on to discuss is the manner by which we should guide ourselves in the manner of the trials, as he calls it here. He says there's no need to legislate, but only to become students ourselves and endeavor to discern in regard to every polity how the best form might come about, and how that which is the least elaborate possible. Moreover, we are now allowed, as it seems, to study, if we choose, the best form of legislation, or if we choose, the least elaborate. So let us make our choice between these two. So we all have a choice. You can think about what is the truly best way to live, or you can look for the simplest life. We all have that choice. And if you're coming to philosophy, hopefully that means you're choosing the best form of legislation. And is it not right that of all the writings which exist in states, those which concern laws should be seen, when unrolled, to be by far the fairest and best, and all other writings to be either modeled on them, or, if disagreeing with them, contemptible? Well, of course, if you're looking at this on the surface story, we can think of many kinds of writings, movies, and literature, and so on, that have nothing to do with governmental laws. But hopefully by now, wherever you see states, you think soul, because that's the analog in this analogy. And so the writings which exist in the soul is a poetical, metaphorical way of talking, and you can see much more depth in this statement. It makes more sense. Okay, first let me read this one, and then I'll explain why I put some things in highlights here. So concerning justice in general, and people, things, or actions that are just, we all agree that these are all beautiful, so that no one would be regarded as saying what was wrong, even if he should maintain that just people, however ugly in body, are quite beautiful in respect of their very just character. Can we be talking about character? We've already seen that this is the manifestation of the state of our soul. And so a just character sounds like a just soul. And so here in one regard, he's saying that soul is more important than body. So stating that idea again. But what we also see is that there's some sort of connection, some sort of interrelationship between justice and beauty. And he states it again here. Every just action, insofar as it shares in justice, practically in the same degree, partakes of beauty. Yes, it is agreed also, if our argument is to be consistent, that a passion which shares in justice becomes so far beautiful. And that is true, Clinias says. So there's this relationship between beauty and justice. And this is something that's good to keep in mind as you're reading other dialogues as well. For example, in the Republic, that height of the cave allegory in the upper world is seeing the sun itself in its own place. And this is in some places in that dialogue described as a vision of the beautiful, the just, and the good. And so often these two words are put together along with goodness as well. And so you want to see how they're used throughout other dialogues as well. It's a good question just to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Okay, now we're going to go into 3 types of unjust acts, and we're going to see that these 3 types correspond to the 3 parts or 3 aspects, if you will, of the soul. To set it up, though, first he gives us that old tenet of his that nobody does wrong willingly. All bad men are in all respects unwillingly bad, he says. And the basic idea here being that even if we know what we're doing is illegal or unethical or it's, hurtful to somebody. Sorry. My throat's getting dry there. Sorry. So even if our behavior is hurtful or we know it's bad in some way or another, still there must be some benefit we're seeing for ourselves. And so there's still some form of ignorance in the soul. And we're always acting from ignorance when we do wrong. And he says that whenever anyone commits any unjust act, great or small, the law shall instruct him and absolutely compel him for the future, either never willingly to dare to do such a deed, or else to do it ever so much less often, in addition to paying for the injury. To effect this, whether by action or speech, by means of pleasures and pains, honors and dishonors, money fines and money gifts, and in general by whatsoever means one can employ to make people hate injustice, and to love or at any rate not hate justice, this is precisely the task of law's most noble. So again, that idea of a just or legal in this dialogue, he's calling it legal penalty, which means a just penalty. Okay, with that as set up, we're going to look at the 3 types of unjust acts. The first one is an unhealthy passion, such as anger or righteousness. And this one is going to focus us on what in Greek is called the thumos, or it's that passionate aspect of the soul. And here's where it's presented. No doubt in conversing with one another you say and hear said at least thus much about the soul, that one element in its nature, be it affection or part, is passion, which is an inbred quality of a contentious and pugnacious kind, and one that overturns many things by its irrational force. So when it's functioning in a healthy way, when the thumos is functioning in a healthy way, it's acting like a guard dog of sorts, protecting the wisdom-loving part of the soul. It's what keeps us on track even though we have certain fears, and it doesn't allow us to get distracted by pleasures, but keeps us focused on seeking wisdom. So this is where courage makes its home. But when it's functioning in an unhealthy way, it can be contentious, it can be pugnacious. Now, the second type of unjust act is ambitiously seeking a desire by any means, even if that desire is unhealthy for the soul. And so this, of course, is focusing us on that desiring aspect of the soul, what in Greek is called the epithumia. And he says, moreover, we distinguish pleasure from passion, and we assert that its mastering power is of an opposite kind, since it affects all that its intention desires by a mixture of persuasion and deceit. So again, in the healthy soul, in the soul that is temperate, the desires will naturally fall in line with what is wise, what is healthy for the soul. But when it's in an unhealthy way, we just want to chase every desire, and we'll use the thumos instead of a guard dog as a kind of we'll kind of employ it for the sake of the desires, to try to persuade people, to trick them with emotional blackmail or that sort of thing, and try to trick people or try to persuade them with logic to follow you, even though it may not be a wise or good thing to do. So that's the unjust act in the epithumia. And then in the logos part of the soul, or the wisdom-loving, I'm tripping over my words again, the wisdom-loving aspect of the soul, errors there called ignorance, of course. So nor would it be untrue to say that the third cause of sins is ignorance. Now I put the Greek here for sins because this is the noun form of amartia, which means to not witness literally, but it's like to make a mistake. So here sins has a much broader meaning than what we use it for today, because of course Plato was writing long before Christianity, so sins has now taken on a different feeling. But what he's talking about here is a much broader meaning, It's just mistakes, wrongdoing, errors. And so we want to keep that definition in mind as we're reading this. Okay, so this cause, however, the lawmaker would do well to subdivide into two, counting ignorance in its simple form to be the cause of minor mistakes, and in its double form, where the folly is due to the person being gripped not by ignorance only, but also by a conceit of wisdom, as though he had full knowledge of things he knows nothing at all about, counting this to be the cause of great and brutal mistakes, when it is joined with strength and might, but the cause of childish and senile mistakes when it's joined with weakness. So the last part meaning that if a person in power has this sort of ignorance where they think they know when they don't, they can do great harm. Whereas if somebody without power acts this way, we can laugh at them and they just seem clownish. Okay, I will now define for you clearly and without complication my notion of justice and injustice. I'm going to pause here because what we're going to see is that this definition, especially of justice, is neither clear nor without complication. And part of that, though, is really because we're reading it 2,000 years later and we're bringing a lot of baggage with us, which could complicate or confuse what we think he means. So I'm going to read it through and then unpack it. But first, about injustice, this pretty much fits exactly what we've been talking about. So remember, justice in the soul, as it was defined in the Republic, is when the soul is guided by the wisdom-loving part, and the thumos, or that passionate part, defends that justice, or that wisdom, and the epithumia, or the desire-loving part, it falls in line with wisdom. The two other parts both follow. And so you have those three proper functionings of those three parts. And with that in mind, we see that injustice is the domination of passion and fear and pleasure and pain and envies and desires in the soul. Whether they do any injury or not, I term generally injustice, right? So passion, fear, pleasure, pain, these are all like if the thumos is guiding, is dominating. And if the desires are dominating, that's also injustice. So that's pretty clear, that's textbook. But when we get to justice, it can be a little bit confusing if we're bringing our modern way of seeing the world to his definition. He says that the belief in the highest good in whatsoever way either states or individuals think they can attain to it, if this prevails in their souls and regulates everyone, even if some damage be done, we must assert that everything thus done is just, and that in each one of us the part subject to this governance is also just and best for the whole life of mankind, although most people suppose that such damage is an involuntary injustice. Now, what complicates this is that we may plug in a different definition than Plato did for what the highest good is. If you look especially at like religious fundamentalists or extremists, you can use this definition to justify holy wars and the Crusades and all kinds of things that Plato is not at all trying to justify or rationalize. We have to think about what he means by the highest good. And in metaphysics, the first cause of all is the good itself, and the gods are seen as only good. And for us in our journey, in our philosophical journey, what we are trying to do is bring a state of goodness to our soul through everything that he's talking about in justice, bringing the three parts of the soul in their proper order and doing their proper job and bringing that unity to the soul, being guided by wisdom. And through our philosophical practice, we are gaining a certain kind of spiritual maturity by having an understanding and then eventually a direct knowledge and of the nature of reality, and working that into our thinking and understanding the experiences that we're having. And through all of this, we are gaining spiritual maturity. And when that prevails in our soul, and that's what regulates us, then our actions will be just. That's what he's saying here. Every law will forbid a person to kill their father or mother, the very authors of his existence, even for the sake of saving his own life, and will ordain that he must suffer and endure everything rather than commit such an act. Seems rather strict on the surface, In this section, though, he's going to be giving us a bunch of laws. And what we want to do throughout this section is to always keep our analogy in mind and think about what he's saying about the soul. I'm going to give you two examples here, first with parents and then with siblings. And so when you're thinking about from the soul's perspective, what does it mean to kill father or mother, then you can see this has some overlap with the crimes against the gods. And so that's why it is such a serious crime. And then when looking at siblings, again, you have that idea of the civil war, the beliefs within the soul, some true, some false, they're fighting it out. And so if right opinion wins out, then that is considered self-defense and you're guiltless. And then in another place in this book, in book 9 here, he talks about if ignorance wins out, and that's a serious crime. So if a brother kills a brother in fight during a civil war or in any such way, acting in self-defense against the other who first started the brawl, he shall be counted as one who has slain an enemy and be held guiltless. Okay, so that's where right opinion wins out. Okay, next to these, we must state the regulations regarding such acts when voluntary and involving iniquity of all kinds and premeditated, acts caused by yielding to pleasure or lust or envy. And we're going to see again, we're going to have 3 different ones here, and they again match to the 3 parts of the soul. So first, let us once more state as best we can how many these causes are likely to be. The greatest is lust, which masters a soul that is made savage by desires, and it occurs especially in connection with that object for which the most frequent and intense craving afflicts the bulk of people. The power which wealth possesses over them, owing to the badness of their nature and lack of culture or education, which breeds in them countless listings after its insatiable and endless acquisition. The reason I included education there is because in some translations education is used instead. Okay, so the desiring part of the soul and wealth is often associated with the wealthy part because the things that we buy with our money are things that satisfy our desires or pleasures. And here we're seeing that if we are made savage by desires, if the desire-loving part of the soul is guiding us, in its most extreme case, this is like addictions. And so that's the first case here. And going on again about wealth as well, a little bit more about that. The noblest and best course of all in all states is that the truth should be stated about wealth, namely that it exists for the sake of the body, and the body for the sake of the soul, so that while the objects for which it really exists are goods, yet wealth itself will come third, after goodness of body and that after soul. So this law will serve as an instructor to teach that the person who intends to be happy must seek not to be wealthy, but to be justly and temperately wealthy. So as we've seen in other places in the laws as well, for Plato, it's not a bad thing to be wealthy, but it is a problem if your desire for wealth overrides your desire to have a healthy soul. Now the second cause is the temper of the ambitious part. This is the thumos of the soul, which breeds envies that are dangerous associates for the person that feels the envy in the first place, and dangerous also for the best citizens in the state. So that's that second part of the soul, that guard dog, ideally, that can sometimes manifest in other ways, such as envy. And this one, the third one, is going to tie to the logos. It's not as obvious on the surface, but I'll unpack it in just a moment. So thirdly, fears bred of cowardice and iniquity have wrought many murders, in cases where people do or have done things concerning which they desire that no one should share their secret. Consequently, if there are any who might expose their secret, they remove them by death, whenever they can do so by no other means. So cowardice is actually associated with the thumos, but when cowardice creeps into a soul, then it's no longer acting as a guard for the wisdom-loving part of the soul, and that's when ignorance can seep in. And then what results from that will be what he's calling many murders. Now, why are there murders? Because one of the roles of the logos, or the wisdom-loving part of the soul, is to watch the state of mind and protect the soul. But when ignorance creeps in, that functioning may also fall off as well. And then instead of being an honest judiciary, if you will, looking over the soul and judging it accurately, you may want to keep secrets. And so that's what I think he means by secrets. Okay, so there he talked about death, and he's going to carry on from there. Thus let it be laid down by law, respecting the nurture and training of living souls, which when gained make life livable, but when missed, unlivable. The unexamined life is not worth living, as Socrates says in the Apology. And respecting the punishments which ought to be imposed in cases of violent death. So when we do act in these wrong ways, we should accept the penalty and see it as just. Okay, next in order after cases of death, which had just been discussed, even the least competent of those who essay legislation would place cases of wounds and maiming. Wounds, just like murders, must be classed under several heads. The involuntary, those done in passion, those done in fear, and all those that are voluntary and deliberate. So, of course, wounds and maiming means that you can recover from it, but you've hurt yourself. It is really necessary for people to make themselves laws and to live according to laws, or else to differ not at all from the most savage of beasts. So this can be understood on both levels, both in the analogy to the soul and seen internally, but also we can apply it to society. But hopefully by now we see that when we talk about creating governmental laws, we don't mean to just be strictly ruled from external forces, but that these laws should be a natural outgrowth of wisdom and those internal laws. The reason thereof is this, that no one's nature is naturally able both to perceive what is of benefit to the civic life of people, and perceiving it, to be alike able and willing to practice what is best. For in the first place, it is difficult to perceive that a true civic art necessarily cares for the public, not the private interest. For the public interest binds states together, whereas the private interest rends them asunder. And to perceive also that it benefits both public and private interest alike, when the public interest rather than the private is well enacted. What I think he's talking about here is showing the connection between our philosophic life and the way we function in society. So this section of Book 9 does, I think, apply to public life, to social life, more than other sections of this dialogue. And when we have a true understanding of who we are, to know thyself, or if we at least have a true opinion of ourselves, that we have this divine essence, then we'll see that in other people as well and feel a certain connection to them. And that translates to the public interest binding the states together. But where people see themselves as just separate from other people, as just physical beings, looking out for number one, then you break that down. When you don't have that unity in the soul, then you're also not going to have that unity in society. Secondly, even if a person fully grasps the truth of this as a principle of art, should he afterwards get control of a state and become an irresponsible autocrat, he would never prove able to abide by this view and to continue always fostering the public interest in the state as the object of first importance, to which the private interest is but secondary. Rather, his mortal nature will always urge him on to grasping and self-interested action, irrationally avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure. Both these objects it will prefer above justice and goodness, and by causing darkness within itself, it will fill to the uttermost both itself and the whole state with all manner of evils. And so here we see the idea that if a person has attained some degree of insight, but only holds it in a theoretical way as a principle of art, when that person is actually put in a position of power, they'll be overcome by the temptations that power gives them, and disaster will follow. Yet if ever there should arise a person competent by nature and by a birthright of divine grace to assume such an office, if there is the true philosopher king, not just in the way it's used in the Republic, but a person who actually reaches that state of mind and then actually runs a government. If that ever should happen, that person would have no need of rulers over him, for no law or ordinance is mightier than knowledge, nor is it right for reason to be subject or enthralled to anything, but to be lord of all things, if it is really true to its name and free in its inner nature. But at present such a nature exists nowhere at all, except in small degree. Wherefore we must choose what is second best, namely ordinance and law, which see and discern the general principle, but are unable to see every instance in detail. So the ideal is for a truly wise person to be leader, but if you don't have that, at least have the written laws that are inspired by wisdom. And that's the second best. So I guess that's Plato's practical side. It will be best to make the following statement next, that in a state where the courts are poor and dumb and decide their cases privily, secreting their own opinions, or, and this is a still more dangerous practice, when they make their decisions not silently but filled with tumult, like theaters roaring out praise or blame of each speaker in turn, then the whole state as a rule is faced with a difficult situation. So remember, Book 9 was about these judicial rulings, these judicial proceedings, and so we're coming back to that idea, the idea of that part of the soul that watches our state of mind, and this idea of secreting their own opinions, that idea of bringing secrecy in, comes back again. So if you have a poor judge looking over your soul, then you're going to have these problems, either these secrets, or also the opposite idea that we really see on in this world of social media, this modern world, where the most ignorant people are the loudest speakers. That's the other way that it manifests, and so this soul is in a terrible condition. But on the other hand, in a state where the courts have the best possible constitution and the prospective judges are well trained and tested most strictly, there it is right and most fitting and proper that we should commit to such judges for decision most of the questions, at least regarding what penalties convicted criminals should suffer or pay. And I'm going to end with this note here, that laws, it would seem, are made partly for the sake of the good, to afford them instruction as to what manner of intercourse will best secure for them friendly association one with another. And also these laws are partly for the sake of those who have shunned education, and who, being of a stubborn nature, have had no softening treatment to prevent their taking to all manner of wickedness. So we can see this on the macro level, but also within our own souls. We can see that laws in part help us to maintain the wisdom we've already gained, but also we are works in progress, so to speak, and so it can also help us with the parts of us that still have room for growth. And so with that, we come to the end of Book 9. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. And as always, if you like what you saw, I really would appreciate you taking just a second to hit the like button. It really does help the algorithm. Next week, I'm going to go on to Book 10. And there, Plato is going to go into more depth of what he means by the crimes against the gods. So I do hope you'll join me for that. Thank you very much.